Hello again. There's so much that's transpired, and I'm in a state of sheer and utter awe again, after having been through the most intense roller coaster to date. I felt like I was burning my life to the ground, and somehow, miraculously, guided through my higher self and team, I rose like a phoenix from the ashes and stepped into so much beauty, awe, surrender, love, connection. And so I'm left in this place of deep gratitude. So I'm going to share with you, try to summarize what's transpired. So the last video that I shared, I had come out of Peru, or had a deeply profound connection to the divine, nourishment of the soul. I was in a retreat with Thomas Hebel's Timeless Wisdom training, and I experienced deep connection with people that I just met for a few minutes, and I could see the effects of that shift. And then I went on a trip with extended family members, and what was such a contrast to that. It was a trip where there was a lot of drinking and dancing and eating, and normally quite a bit of fun, but given the contrast to what I'd experienced, it just felt like it was showing me how life after life after life, I had just been teetering in the darkness, worrying about what college the kids should go to and what job are they going to get, and do we have enough money saved, and eating ourselves until we fall asleep, and then getting up and doing it over and over and over. And I couldn't do it. And I started distancing, meditating more. And what kept coming up again was, I need a separate space to heal. I'm not going to release and heal in this way. And I was debating whether to tell my husband. I thought, let me just rent a place and then I'll tell him. And I was worried of getting swayed out of it or convinced not to do it. And kind of an impulse, I thought, let me tell him. So what had started happening, just to give you some context of why I felt the need to do that, is, so my husband and I, as I shared before, are almost perfect polar opposites. We don't even agree on death. He's an agnostic, clinical, evidence-based physician. I've become an energy healer, a guide, a coach, but I've really dipped deeply into the spiritual journey and experiencing what I would characterize as a spiritual awakening, moving through this deep healing process. I was in a ayahuasca journey in 2024 where they showed me that my husband and I had played all these roles for each other across many lives, and that in this life, he's actually an ascended master that went deeper into the darkness than me to be my perfect polar opposite. And that as I was going to ascend to my light, he was going to descend to his darkness. And at some point, he would crack open and join me on the journey. And so I was like, okay, this is like Jedi training. I can take the polarity. It's a gift. And I started to see the beauty of embracing that, being able to see the polar opposite view, and then, of course, everything in between. And I know from healing and spiritual growth that the more perspectives you can see of the truth, then you start to get a better and better sense of the truth itself, as opposed to one perspective, one view. And what I started to do unconsciously was go on these retreats. So whether it was psychedelic journeys, or whether it was meditation retreats with the Vipassana, or whether it was the Hubel program, and I would go there, these very safe containers, where the next layer of trauma or conditioning blocks would come to the surface, and I would release them in this safe container. And then what started happening was, in my day-to-day, there's been a real acceleration, as many of you are tuning into, on the planet, with the shifts astrologically and the impact it's having both individually and collectively, in terms of more chaos, more darkness, more trauma coming to the surface, more emotional and physical pain. So what I started to do then was, I started experiencing what I would normally experience in a psychedelic journey or a Vipassana retreat at home, in my day-to-day. And my husband wasn't ready to deal with that. Doesn't have the capacity. He's not familiar with how to deal with trauma or blocks or that type of thing. And so he was at a loss, or it would trigger him when one of these patterns would emerge, or one of my traumas would be triggered from something in my day-to-day. I would go into fight or flight, and then it would trigger him, and he would go into fight or flight. So then we would escalate. And so every so often we'd come to the point of, okay, we can't do this. This is never going to work. I started thinking about, do I have to leave? That was the last question that I had in order to continue my healing journey. And so now on this trip, I tried to share what was happening for me and how I think I need to step away and give myself space to heal. I'm getting too triggered. I'm not releasing the pattern. So I can't step in the next part of my journey. And he tried to understand, but he really didn't understand why I needed to do that. And then finally came to, I don't think we should do that. I think distance will just create more distance. I think we should either stay together and work it out, or we should get divorced. And then I went into fear, really high level of fear. And What I'd noticed in the home, this is also the fear that I started tapping into, was when the trauma occurred, I would stay in my bedroom. I was safe in my bedroom with my parents. It was only when I went out that I would get taken away for the abuse to happen. So there was a safety by staying in my bedroom, even in my bed, which is my safest place in the home. And I started to feel terror when he would come into the room when I was doing energy healing, or when he would hear conversations I was having about spiritual topics. I would feel terror, fear, and I would become paralyzed. And so I was seeing how I can feel his energy. I was trying to explain this all to him. When he comes in the room, because I'm becoming more sensitive, I can feel his energy, and it takes my energy down if I feel judgment, criticism, or there's not support. So we were discussing this, and I went into fear. I went into high level of fear, and I just deferred. Okay, we'll figure it out. We'll figure it out. I woke up the next morning in rage. And overnight, these fragments that are trying to come to the surface and heal, that won't be suppressed any longer, these exile parts. So it came to the surface. And I was sharing with him stuff he'd said that created all this fear and intimidation. And I said, if that's the choice, then I choose divorce. Let's separate. And I was really angry. There was so much anger. And he was shocked. He said, I can't believe you're choosing the path over us. That's so sad. And I said, I don't know if you realize what you're asking of me. I have discovered the deepest connection to self, the divine, that's given me such nourishment of the soul. And I'm being shown a path of how to get there and how to bring that to other people. So it's everything I could possibly dream or want. I've discovered a path towards it. I'm being shown. And if there's truth to it, it can help many in larger parts of humanity or the collective. So what you're asking me to do is to give up happiness, peace, belonging, connection, destiny, to stay asleep with you and everyone else. And I said, even if I could do that, which I don't want to, I'm starting to get more and more physical pain. My low back started popping out on this trip, out of alignment. And I knew that it's because I'm not able to release these patterns, and it's going to manifest as more emotional and physical pain. I said, I think I'm going to die here. I don't think this is a choice. I think I'm going to be taken kicking and screaming or gracefully surrendering. But this freight train is off. This baby is going to be born one way or another. So I don't really feel like it's a choice. It feels like a calling or destiny that's unfolding. And so he was like, fine. And this kind of awkward silence for a couple of days. And on our way back, one of the mornings, as we were traveling back, I was meditating in the hotel room. And it was 3:30 in the morning. I was in a very deep meditation. And my husband said, hey, can I come close to you? And he came close. He put his arms around my knees. And he said, I feel like everything's falling apart. I said, in general or with us? He said, with us. And I said, it is. And there was this long, pregnant pause. And then I said, but I think that might be the path to healing. And after a few minutes, he said, I'm so scared of the unknown. What's going to happen to us? And what's the future? And I was still in this very calm place, and I just found myself saying, the unknown can be scary. But it also means that we're not replaying old patterns of the past. The familiar might be old patterns of the past. We're moving into the unfamiliar. And I know he didn't digest, but then maybe 15 minutes later, he said, I think the most important thing is for us to stay together. And I could feel his fear. I was wincing a little bit. He said, I'm prepared to do more to win back your affection. I'll do Vipassana. There was a voice that said, don't say anything. Let him work through his innate process. And we'll see where things land. And I woke up the next morning, and I asked him, do you remember what you said last night? He said, yeah. I said, did you mean it? He goes, yeah. And I was elated. I thought, oh my gosh, this is a miraculous turn of events. So on the flight back, I was reading this book, Intimate Communion. It's all about relationships. It's beautiful. About the evolution of relationships, very resonant to what we've been experiencing. Going from codependence to 50-50 relationships to intimate communion. I highly recommend it. And so I was reading passages to him, and we were talking about how I can retrofit the house, and we were looking at Vipassana schedules, and he's like, okay, I can do it in January. I was like, January. All right, let's do that. And we'll sign up in October. We put it in the calendar, and I got back home all excited and energized, and sharing with the kids and a couple of friends, and all of them unanimously were saying, basically, you realize this is coming from fear of you leaving. It's not intrinsically motivated. So there might be resistance or resentment, like you've seen all the previous times you've tried to force change. And then it just stopped me in my tracks. Oh, I wanted it to see it so badly. And my kids are just old souls in my life. One of them had said, why does your healing depend on him changing? Do what you need to do. Honor yourself. And you have followed your heart in every other realm. And look where it's brought you. All these gifts, all this joy, and a whole new path. What makes you think it would be any different in this realm? Your whole belief system is about following your heart. Maybe you should put your money where your mouth is. And I was like, wow. And he said, this is going to suck. It's going to be really hard. Dad's going to be really upset. And I just started crying because there was so much resonance. And he came over and he put his arms around me and said, but it's going to be okay. And he started to share with his family. And the way he characterized it, we're separating for some time. And I was getting an Airbnb for a month. And it didn't feel right to say separation, but I don't know, we didn't have any other language. And I was feeling so much fear. I am destroying our family. I'm throwing my life away. I'm burning it down. And stepping over this threshold, be by myself, I was terrified. So much fear. And I was talking to a friend of mine. I said, why are you calling it a separation? It's more like mommy needs time and space to heal. Yeah, that feels more resonant. Separation is when you've decided typically that you're well on your way to divorce. I shared that with my husband and he said, well, what would she call it? I was like, I don't know. And he was talking to his friend of his that day and he came back and he said, my friend was asking and suggesting, maybe you're having a midlife crisis. Are you? And I was like, well, I wouldn't call it that. It was more like a spiritual awakening, but yeah, I think it has elements of that, definitely. Then he was like, okay, take the time and space you need. I hope you come back to me. Suddenly just the changing of the language allowed him to see it in a very different light that was less scary and threatening. And then, as coincidences go, that evening, I was reading this intimate communion book that I recommend. And the chapter I was reading is called Midlife Crisis versus Vision Quest. And I was talking about the author who had felt like he fulfilled his purpose in the workplace and no longer felt inspired by that and went to France for a month to meditate. And his wife, who was in California, was starting to wonder whether he loved her anymore. And what they were saying was because this culture doesn't have a language for the spiritual awakening, they call it a midlife crisis. And for those that can't handle it, they end up having affairs or buy new cars or quit their jobs, get divorced, etc. Those that are often drawn into this spiritual path or other ways of self-development, self-reflection. And they said if they can embrace it, then they can come back renewed and refreshed to their family. And so I was reading this, just like, Vision Quest sounds even better than midlife crisis. Let's call it that. You're on a vision quest. I thought, sure, let's call it that. So suddenly it started to change the framing. I was going away for a month to go on a vision quest to see if I could find my purpose and get more clarity. And actually, right before I went, there were all these incredible validations. And I even met a woman the day that I was going to leave. I happened to set up a meeting with a woman. I'd been in the program with her for almost 2 years, but never met with her one-on-one. And I met with her, and it turned out she had just come back from a 1-month leave from her own husband, wanted to also allow herself space to heal, and now was trying to think about where she wanted to go next. And she had all this wisdom of what was happening in my situation, and I was in awe. Just the sheer validation from my higher self every step of the way. So I went away to the Airbnb, and I went for silence for 5 days. And just before I went, another thing that happened, a couple of really interesting things. One was my aunt. She's a Reiki master and a theta healer, very powerful one. And now she's been that for 20 years. I just never felt called. I don't know why when I think about it. She's an energy healer. And I had the thought once in a while, but just never felt called or drawn. My mom had called me right before I left a couple days and said, hey, have you dropped off that suitcase of stuff I wanted to give her? And it's like, oh, I forgot. I better call her. I called her. And she said, yeah, you can drop it off this weekend if you want. And we were catching up a little bit. She mentioned theta healing. I'm like, theta healing? Can I experience that? She said, sure, come over. And so I went over there to do a session with her. And then she said, your energy is so depleted. If you're willing to come to me for 10 days in a sequence, I can do this remotely as well. I would love to replenish your energy. And she said, I can also check your aura for waywards, and I can also clear your chakras if you need it. And I can give you Reiki for your low back issues and help you heal that. And I was like, wow, yeah, let's start now. She's like, well, I'm going back to India on August 4th, but we can always do the last few sessions online. Well, it turns out 10 days from that day was August 3rd. And I was like, I'm going to be in silence. And she said, you can continue your silence. When you come here, I'll do the healing and you just leave. And what was even more amazing was She said, after I do the healing, do you mind if I make fresh food every day that you come? And so it ended up being just like Vipassana in a lot of ways. I was getting this healing, and I was getting fresh food, and I was able to maintain the silence for this week. And there were some fascinating things that came up in the silence. And it took a couple days for me to settle in, like it often does in these Vipassana retreats. And then I felt my higher self starting to come in, and I started to feel the movement and the energy and the activation. And then I started being led to things, I noticed. So before I'd gone, there was another friend of mine who's an astrologer who had looked at the human design charts for me, my business partner, the kids, my husband, and looked at all the iterations in my life to see if there were insights, and then spent several hours with me going through it. There were some very interesting insights from that I won't go into all the details at this moment. But basically, when I was in the silent retreat, I suddenly got this message from my higher self to look at the connections, both in the business relationship and my marriage. And so then I went and looked at the human design chart, and there were two big learnings. So one of the things that was happening was when I went to go see my aunt, I would just see, was there any video that I feel called my higher self? Often they would use video or books or messages for me to hear based on what's happening for me. So when I started going to her, I would start seeing if is there anything that shows up in my feed. I don't watch much video content at all, but sometimes I'll feel really called to something in my feed that just shows up. And it'll usually be the one that just appears. And so there was a video where Pam Gregory talked about the South and North Node, and how the South Node is your karma and your past and your history, and the North Node is your dharma, your future, your destiny. And that's true with the chakras. The South Node is just below the first chakra, which is your karma, and the North Node is just above your seventh chakra, which is your dharma, your future. And so as you release karma, you can let more dharma in, your purpose. And so I had heard this, and it really resonated with me, the video that I listened to. And when I came back, I felt called to looking at where my North and South Node were. So then what I found then, when I was looking at both the human design chart and the birth chart, North and South Node, were two messages. My South Node, my boundaries dissolve, and I become the other person. They dissolve so completely that I can't, in my relationship with my husband and the human design chart, it suggested that I had to step out of his aura in order to have my own thoughts, because I would blend so much with his. And he would end up setting the emotional tone and the direction. And it would be really hard for me to do that. And I was like, wow, that is so resonant. And I realized why I was feeling so strongly about stepping away then. And then even with my business partnership, because my business partner is very good at dissolving boundaries and developing very deep connections with people. And it reinforced my South Node, where I dissolve boundaries and become other. And my growth path goes from the seventh house to the first house. The first house is the house of self. It's all about identity. So my growth trajectory from my South Node to my North Node, my past lives to my purpose, is about developing an outline, a sense of self, but then also still interacting and engaging with others. And then the second amazing message was, I'm not meant to leave these relationships. I'm meant to become independent in relationship. And I was so blown away by that. Why I feel like I keep getting pulled back in, even though I want to separate and escape. And when I discover all these deferral patterns, or I feel fear of intimacy, my instinct is to separate, is to distance. So I got these two really amazing messages. And then while I was there, my husband had started reading this book called Hold Me Tight that his therapist had recommended. And I got this message then to start reading it myself. So I downloaded it and I was reading it. And it's all about attachment theory, which I've shared in a previous video, but it's basically the idea that how we attach or how we relate to our parents, especially the mother figure, determines how we are in relationship as we get older. And there's secure attachment, where you have your own sense of self, but you can also engage with other. You have higher self-esteem, you trust other people, you can have intimacy. That's what secure attachment looks like. Insecure attachment, there's multiple types. I went into that video, so I'll just do a link to it here. There's insecure attachment. Basically, you can have different types. You either distance, you're very independent and you distance from people, or you're clingy, or you could be disorganized attachment, which is basically you push and pull. And people with trauma often want closeness desperately, but then as soon as they get it, they distance because of what happened in the trauma. So there can be this push and pull. So essentially, they were talking about how that plays out in relationships. And you might as well plugged our names in. What they were describing was literally the things that we're moving through. And what they talked about were these patterns that emerge from insecure attachment, and these exile parts or these fragile parts come to the surface. And when they're not met, anger kicks in, the protector. And if one of the people in the relationship can become aware of this, they can actually then bring it home, become vulnerable, soften, and then the other person may be able to also soften. So I was reading this and feeling all of this awe about what was transpiring. And the other thing that I noticed while I was in silence was I spent the first 2 days unconsciously in my bedroom. I ate there, I meditated there, I slept there. It was only on the third day that I started feeling comfortable sitting in the family room, making food and actually enjoying it there. And then I started realizing I was behaving like a caged animal that was afraid to come out, even though the door is unlocked. It's not just home, and it's not just my husband. This is something in my system. And I remembered in a past life that I'd been shown for my second chakra, where I was trapped in a room and then repeatedly abused. And then even in this trauma, the bed was a safe place for me. And it was only when I went out that the trauma would occur. And so again, it was reinforcing this feeling of wanting to stay in this kind of a cocoon, which is what I felt when I went to Peru. I wanted to be in a cocoon, a safe place to heal. But as I started to become more comfortable, then I started to venture out. And then the other thing that was amazing was, so I was listening to these videos, and the videos that I were drawn to then were Brian Scott and the Operators. And he's been channeling their messages for, I don't know how long, maybe a year or something. But I had been called to these 4 videos. And they were each now talking about 4-phrase statements to make that will accelerate the healing process. And the first video I saw was the first phrase. And when I heard that video, the resonance to everything I believe and everything that I've been led to, messages I've received, so resonant. I started crying. I was in so much awe. And they were talking about sacred heart, connecting to the higher self, how we're in a simulation, how joy is how we create, how the whole point is to release the trauma and to then awaken. So it was basically very resonant to all of my understanding and experiences. So the phrases are, across these 4 videos, are, I am the one who creates, the light moves through me, reality bends towards my joy, I have always been this. Those are the 4. And they talk about what's the relevance of each of those. I came back to the house and I was in this highly expanded state. My heart was wide open. I thought, wow, we can work through anything. Everything will be great. Like I am every time I come back from these journeys or these meditations. By the next day, I was super triggered. So I came over and I was trying to be physically affectionate with my husband, and he was tired. He came back from work, so he just went to sleep. The next morning, again, I was trying to come close to him and cuddle up with him, and he was like, oh, I need to run an errand, or I need to do a task. And then anger came in, rage came in. And then it triggered him, and then pretty soon we were back in the same place. These heated arguments where this is never going to work. And it was a couple days before I was going to the next place. So I went to go see my aunt. And what was interesting about the healing that she was doing, she had checked my aura for the waywards. There are entities that latch into your aura and they're drawing your energy, or they're sending you negative energy. And she said, everybody has them and I can help you clear them. And she checked them and she's like, you don't have any waywards. I've never seen that before. And then she checked my chakras and she was going to clear them. And the second chakra and the fifth chakra were the 2 that needed clearing. And I could feel when she would do the Reiki on my low back, I could literally feel the heat and the pain diminishing. So my back is dramatically better now. I'd say 80% better just from those 10 days. And then she also said there was a little bit here, but she was like, your chakras are so clear. And she said, your heart chakra is so pure and so open. You should send energy. You should send love out. And then she said, your third eye is very open, very clear. And she was surprised. So it was very validating to get this message from a third party that doesn't know what's been transpiring. Anyway, I went to her and she was doing another healing. As I was healing, I started to see the pattern, just like they talked about in the book. So one of the things that's happened is because of the trauma, because I suppressed my needs and desires, and it was all about extrinsic validation, and it was about performing to get that validation. So I had developed an existential fear of non-compliance to authority, because when I didn't comply with what they wanted in the trauma, they would literally suffocate me to death or severely abuse me. And so then I developed this literal existential fear of non-compliance to authority. And anyone I put into a position of authority, whether it's my husband or my boss or my partner, I immediately drop everything and want to do what they're asking. So I keep deferring. And I have this terror and fear, I realized, as a baseline when I can't do that. And so that's why I would go into such extreme fight or flight when my views were so different than my husband's, because I'm not getting his approval and validation. So I go into this crazy level of terror and fear. But my inner conviction, my higher self are all pulling me in that direction. So it was just this internal war that's going on. And of course, coming out on the outside. So what I started to do as I was healing was I started honoring my needs and desires and letting those parts of me come to the surface, unlike ever before. But they're fragile and they're sensitive and they're like little kids tiptoeing out from hiding. And so when I expressed my need for physical affection, which I haven't done, and it couldn't be met, the anger kicked in. The protector came back in and suppressed the exiled part. And so I was going to tell my husband what I discovered and realized. And on my ride back, I looked to see if there was a video. And 2 hours earlier was the fourth video of the sequence from the operators. I thought that can't be a coincidence, the timing of it. I listened to the video, and what they were talking about was that now the architects of the simulation are learning from us because we have now done things that they weren't expecting. They didn't realize it was possible. So in most parts of the rest of the universe, the density is very low. If there's a thought, creation is instantaneous. It manifests instantly. But on the Earth plane, which is one of the densest places in the universe, because of that density, a thought doesn't manifest right away. So there's a creative process that's required to manifest. So it's the place where a lot of these other civilizations are so keenly watching, what is that creative process? Because it happens so fast everywhere else, they can't see it. It takes creators that have the courage to go into the depths of darkness, like deep sea divers that Clemens talks about. Deep into the depths of that density, the darkness. And from that place, if they can become conscious, it's a 0-point signal that Brian Scott talked about, ripples outward and has powerful impact, evolutionary growth, and impact to the collective, to consciousness. So they said, if you can say these 4 phrases in the depths of that darkness, it's like bringing light into the darkness. So I thought, why don't I try it? I'm in the middle of a crazy contraction. They actually use the word contraction and expansion, which is very familiar to me. I was in the middle of this contraction with my husband. So right there in the car, they said, put your hand on your sacred heart and feel into it, say these 4 phrases. So I did that. And my body started to shake, shudder. And then I started to cry so much that I couldn't even breathe, and I pulled over. And then I felt a release of anger and fear, a huge release from my system. And I moved into this highly ecstatic state of joy and peace, love. And I went home in awe. And then I was sharing it with my husband, and not all of this part, but just what I discovered with the fragment and the anger that rose. And we started having these really good conversations. Then we were planning a date night. We'll do massages and then we'll have a romantic evening. And the evening came, and then he suggested watching a movie, and I thought, what happened to our massages? The movie went till 11 o'clock. By then I was pissed. And then when we're heading to bed, I'm like, I have no interest now. It's so late. There was no build up to this evening. There was no setup. I don't feel it. And I was so angry. And then he got angry then. We both just turned away from each other. In rage and anger came to the surface. I had expressed a need. He knew how much this means to me and how much I'm trying. I'm going away again, and all this anger. And as I was lying there, my back turned to him. I suddenly remembered, oh, I'm in the depth of a contraction. Can I go into the center of that and say these 4 phrases? So I leaned in. I moved into what felt like the eye of that storm. And I said the 4 phrases. A few hours later, my husband turned around, put his arms around me. He was like, I'm so sorry. And can I just hold you? And I just melted. I melted in tears. Then the next morning, another thing triggered us. And again, I said it. And now within a few minutes, he came back. I was like, this is like magic. So then we were able to start having these conversations where he was like, so what exactly is going to happen? What's going on? And it went from, she's crazy, I don't believe and understand, until there was some curiosity now. He's like, the best predictor of the future is the current state. History repeats itself, and there's no reason to believe all these crazy things are going to suddenly all happen. This makes sense. And what I said to him was, something that he's complained about a dozen times, is we graduated from MIT in 1995. If we'd known about the tech boom, we could have been big, right? I've heard him talk about that. So what I said to him was, remember how you bring that up with the tech boom? What if I have a pulse of the next big thing coming? What if that's what this is? And his eyes widened, and he was like, you got to tell me how to invest then. How should we invest this financially? And I started laughing, and normally I would just blow it off. And then I suddenly got another hit. I said, okay, you're all about hedging bets and probabilities and statistics. And in your worldview, one of us is wrong. We can't both be right. So why muddy the waters? What if you were to pursue, assuming things will continue as they have, and you continue managing the finances, you invest as you believe with your insight and your experience. You don't let me muddy the waters. Meanwhile, I'm already pursuing the new world that I believe is coming about and investing all my time and energy into that. So if I'm wrong, you have us covered. And if you're wrong, I have us covered. And he was suddenly like, wow, let's try that. It created a way for us to work and live in parallel without having to convince each other and without having to discount or dismiss. It became the plan to diversify our investments in his worldview. So I was getting language now to bridge these worlds by removing some of these layers and healing enough that I could now engage in the conflict. Going away allowed me to release enough and hear my higher self and develop the conviction and to come back into the conflict and now find ways to bridge these worlds. I was heading out for an errand and my husband's sitting on the couch. Normally I wrap my arms around his shoulders and from the back just give him a kiss on the back of his neck. This time I did that on my way out and he held my arms and he said, I want to be here for your transition. I want to be here for you. And I just ordered a book. It's called Allies in Healing. It's all about helping your partner that's had childhood sexual trauma. He's like, I want to be better. I should have done this earlier, but I want to be better and I want to be here for you. And I just started crying because I was in so much awe of how things were unfolding. And then I ended up going to my next place. And the kids were coming there. And then when I was there, I noticed when they were going to come, I had all this anxiety. What are they going to need? What do they want? How do I make it a good thing? And it's like, I couldn't do anything all day. No writing, no meditating. This is my own pattern. This has really nothing to do with them. I'm in my own place. So this was another set of experiments. And then as I was there and I saw my husband and he came to visit and I could see him trying really hard to be here for me. There was a softening and we were able to both come back in when we get triggered and start to discuss it. And the thought that came to me was before, my instinct is to run away because the fight or flight because so large previously and I felt so much fear and terror. And the idea of asking for what I needed was so alien and so terrifying that I just wanted to run away. So the thought came to me, maybe I can take a step before running away. I have nothing to lose because I'm willing to leave. So what if I were to express what I really need and want and see how it's received and see if we could process it? So I shared that whole thing with my husband. He was like, yeah, let's try that. He was so calm and so supportive. It felt like such an impossible thing before, but when we came to this place, it seemed so simple. I mean, of course, I had to go through mountains and valleys and crazy amounts of fear to step across that threshold and come to this place. So then I canceled the rest of the Airbnbs, and in 2 weeks, miraculously, we came to this place. And I don't expect it to just be rainbows and roses. I believe we will have conflict. But what's been amazing is that I feel like now I have the capacity to actually start to work through it and to hold space for him and start to see where it takes us. And what was fascinating that left me in so much more awe was there's a group that I've been pulled into, and we're looking to help negotiators heal. So in the midst of deep conflict in parts of the world, helping them heal is a way to help improve those conflicts. And interestingly, one of the things that had developed in this group was there was a number of folks that were coming, including me, that wanted to start meeting on our own because we felt this really deep connection. We're all in the healing path. We're all having these fantastical experiences. And so we started meeting on our own. And we started noticing that one of the leads in the group was a very polarized energy, almost masculine, left hemisphere dominant, and wanted to get things done and progress quickly and have timelines and add value. And we initially had this allergic reaction to that and thought, I don't know if I want to be in this group. That energy doesn't feel right. The question started coming up, why is this showing up in our field? And all the others were feeling the same way that I was meeting with. And it almost felt like it was just polarization then. Then interestingly, one of the other leads came to a meeting, and it was just the few of us that had been having this separate conversation. And she'd shared that she wasn't sure she could be in it either because of the same dynamic. And then we shared, hey, we're experiencing the same things. We all started processing it and holding space for each other. That was nurturing and nourishing enough to vocalize. And there were tears, and there was people relaxing and feeling safe. And then what started to happen was one of the folks said, he's actually representing the group we're targeting. They are not into trauma, healing, consciousness. This will sound like woo to them. So he's actually representing that group. And then suddenly something dawned on me. And I shared with them the thing I realized with my husband, because there was this polarization between us, was that I needed to step away to give myself space, because this part of me that's trying to emerge, the feminine, the exile part, the fragile part, is over dominated by whatever you want to call it now, the patriarchy, the dominant energy, the old world energy, the masculine, and it can quickly crumble under fear, which was my story. And I finally felt like I needed to step away in order to give myself enough strength in a nurturing space to come back into the conflict and now engage in a way that is productive. And I was sharing it with them, and I said, part of what I realized is that there's two things. One, that the parts that are protecting us may be anger, and it may be polarized to this part, but it's here for a very intelligent reason. It is helping us bridge to what we need for the people we're targeting. But it's a polarized experience, so maybe that's why we've been drawn to meet separately and to create a nurturing space for us to let this energy of the new world, the feminine or the exile parts, come to the surface and develop enough strength to come back into the conversation. But everyone's like, wow, that feels like exactly what we should do. And we can even tell them that this is what's happening. We're seeing this polarization. We're feeling a need to create a space for this new energy. And then we want to continue the engagement and see how we can start to develop language and tools and techniques that allow us to bridge these worlds and find productive solutions. And what we move through in that dynamic within this project is exactly what will help the people that we're serving, who are negotiators trying to resolve polarized views. So we will have embodied viscerally the solution, and then it's that much more powerful. And what I experienced with my husband was a fractal of what I was now being led to in community, in collective, which would then help larger groups of the population. So suddenly I was in so much awe that what I had moved through with my husband had so many more dimensions of why, part of a larger collective design and a much greater intelligence that's orchestrating these elements that aren't obvious to me in the moment. But the more and more I can follow my heart and honor what's arising, at some point I see, like I have so many times before, the beauty of the journey, and I'm left in sheer and utter awe and wonder. So that's where I'm at. And I don't know what's going to happen next, but I'm really excited. We have the solar eclipse on the 12th, and the thing that we realized that we're going to do next with this group that's now meeting is towards the end of our conversation, a couple people were saying it feels like masculine and feminine energy that are like fighting almost. And how do we harmonize across them? And what I shared with them and what I realized was, I said, this is what I've been led to in the healing. So the Shushumna channel, the central energetic channel, has all the chakras. When you clear the chakras of the trauma and you activate Ida and Pingala, which are the two energetic channels, the masculine and feminine, around the central channel and converge at the third eye through breathing, which I also do in the energy healing, then the Kundalini energy starts to rise. That's energy of the new world. And then that takes you to the second stage of enlightenment, at the crown of the head. So what I was sharing with them was almost like we've literally come to the place that, and I'm feeling called to taking us through an energy clearing and a healing in collective with this group to see what emerges. How can we start to bring to the surface the things that are no longer serving us and want to be released, the trauma? And then through that, start to find and be guided by our higher selves and this collective design and the unfolding of how we can now serve the collective. So I'm looking forward to seeing what happens. Thank you for staying with me on the journey.